The war-torn planet of Tartarus IV was a graveyard for armor. Once a thriving world with blue skies and verdant landscapes, it had become a desolate wasteland, with the air thick with the acrid scent of burning metal and the haunting echoes of battle. The skies were now a permanent gray, choked with the smoke of burning tanks and the screams of the dying. Amidst the chaos, a lone human tank, the Maverick's Revenge, stood tall against the backdrop of devastation. This was not just any tank, it was a legend in the making. The Maverick's Revenge, a heavily modified M90 dreadnought, had survived countless skirmishes and emerged victorious against odds that would have crushed lesser machines. It was a testament to the indomitable will of its crew, a group of 5 who had become one with the steel beast they commanded. At the helm was Commander James "Hawk" Wilson, a grizzled veteran with a face lined by years of combat and eyes that had seen more death than anyone should. His experience made him a master tactician, his instincts razor-sharp, honed by the countless battles he had fought and survived. He peered out of the tank's cupola, scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy, his every nerve attuned to the dangers that lurked just beyond the next ridge. His crew, each hand-picked from the best the human forces had to offer, worked in perfect sync, each one a master of their craft. Lieutenant Tom Bradley, the gunner, was known for his uncanny precision. He could put a round through an enemy tank's viewport from a mile away. His eyes were always locked onto the target, his hands steady as he waited for the perfect shot. Beside him was Sergeant Rachel Patel, the loader, who moved with a speed and accuracy that could only be described as superhuman. Her hands were a blur as she fed the massive shells into the cannon, each one loaded with a precision that would put a machine to shame. She was the heart of the Maverick's Revenge, ensuring that the tank's deadly punch never faltered. Corporal Jake "Mac" McCarthy, the driver, was the one who made the Maverick dance. He was a virtuoso behind the controls, weaving the massive tank through the battlefield with a finesse that defied its size. Every turn, every swerve, was executed with a grace that belied the tank's bulk, keeping them one step ahead of the enemy's guns. And then there was Private First Class Lisa Nguyen, the comms expert, who sat in the bowels of the tank with her headset on, a lifeline between the Maverick's Revenge and the rest of the human forces. Her voice was calm and steady, even in the heat of battle, coordinating artillery strikes and relaying vital information that kept them ahead of the enemy. She was the eyes and ears of the crew, ensuring they were never caught off guard. Their mission was simple in its brutality: hold the line against an enemy that seemed to have an endless supply of armor. The alien forces, known as the Kralian, had been pushing the humans back for months, their tanks a seemingly endless tide of steel and fire. The Kralian were a fearsome foe, their technology advanced, their warriors relentless. But the crew of the Maverick's Revenge had faced them before and lived to tell the tale. They knew what they were up against, and they were ready. As the ground trembled with the approach of the Kralian horde, Commander Wilson tightened his grip on the cupola's edge. He could see them now, just on the horizon, a wall of steel and firepower, advancing like a tidal wave ready to wash them away. But the Maverick's Revenge was no ordinary tank, and its crew was no ordinary team. They had faced death before and laughed in its face. Today would be no different. With a steady voice, Wilson issued the first of many orders. "Bradley, eyes on the lead tank. Patel, keep those shells coming. Mac, hold steady. Nguyen, I want every piece of intel we can get on their formation." The crew snapped into action, their movements fluid and precise. The battle for Tartarus IV was about to reach its climax, and in the middle of it all stood the Maverick's Revenge, the last hope in a sea of despair. As the first shots rang out and the world exploded into fire and fury, the crew knew one thing for certain: today they would either become legends or die trying. The Kralian army was a force to be reckoned with. Their invasion of Tartarus IV had been swift and brutal, a calculated campaign of destruction that left no room for mercy or hesitation. The Kralian, an ancient race with millennia of warfare under their belts, were relentless in their pursuit of victory. Their tanks, known as Devourers, were the pinnacle of their war technology. massive war machines with armor thick enough to shrug off most human weaponry. These devourers were a nightmare on treads. Each one was a hulking beast, twice the size of a human tank, with an array of deadly weaponry that could turn a battlefield into a graveyard in minutes. They were equipped with railguns that could punch through any known armor, plasma cannons that could vaporize anything in their path, and missile pods capable of saturating an area with explosive death. The Kralian took no chances. They came to win, and they came prepared. The Kralian warriors who crewed these tanks were no less formidable. Standing over 7 feet tall, their bodies were encased in exoskeletal armor that enhanced their already formidable strength. Their skin had a metallic sheen, a result of their advanced nanotechnology that allowed them to interface directly with their machines. Their eyes, glowing with an eerie, otherworldly energy, were windows into the cold, calculating minds that drove them. These were not beings that knew fear or hesitation. They were bred for war, and their sole purpose was to crush any who stood in their way. Zorvath, the Kralian commander leading the assault on Tartarus IV, was one of the most feared tacticians in the Kralian military. His reputation was one of ruthless efficiency. He had never lost a battle, and he had no intention of starting now. From his command seat in the lead devourer, Zorvath gazed out at the human forces with a mixture of contempt and anticipation. He knew that the humans were tenacious, but he also knew that they were hopelessly outmatched. His force of 200 devourers was the largest ever assembled for a single operation. This was no ordinary skirmish. This was the final push, the decisive blow that would break the human resistance on Tartarus IV and secure the planet for the Kralian Empire. Zorvath's mind was already moving beyond this battle, calculating the next steps in the campaign that would bring humanity to its knees. As the Kralian horde began to move, their tanks rolled forward with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The ground shook under the weight of the devourers, a low rumble that sent a shiver through the human lines. The human forces, vastly outnumbered and outgunned, could only watch as the tide of steel and death closed in on them. There was no time for fear, only the grim determination to fight to the last. Inside the Maverick's Revenge, the crew felt the vibrations of the approaching enemy, their senses heightened by the tension in the air. Commander Wilson, his eyes fixed on the horizon, saw the first glint of metal as the devourers came into view. They were as massive and terrifying as the reports had described, their dark silhouettes stark against the gray sky. "Here they come," Wilson muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the Maverick's engines. Lieutenant Bradley adjusted his targeting scope, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Just say the word, Commander." Sergeant Patel checked the ammunition feed one last time, ensuring everything was ready. "Loaded and ready, sir." Corporal McCarthy tightened his grip on the controls, his eyes focused on the terrain ahead. "I've got us covered, Commander." Private Nguyen's hands flew over her console, her voice steady as she relayed information to the other human units. "Artillery is ready to fire on your mark, Commander. No sign of aerial support yet." Wilson nodded, his mind racing through the possibilities. They were outnumbered nearly 20 to 1, but he had no intention of going down without a fight. The Maverick's Revenge was more than just a tank. It was a symbol of human defiance, a statement that, no matter the odds, humanity would stand its ground. The Kralian horde was closing in now, their tanks fanning out in a wide formation designed to overwhelm the human defenses from multiple angles. Zorvath's strategy was clear: surround the humans, crush them from all sides, and leave nothing but ashes in their wake. But Wilson had other plans. "Nguyen, get me a direct line to command," Wilson ordered, his voice firm. "Channel open, sir," Nguyen replied, her fingers dancing across the controls. "This is Commander Wilson of the Maverick's Revenge," he said, his voice steady and calm. "We're about to engage the enemy. We're outnumbered, but we're not out. Tell command we're going to hold this line, no matter what it takes." There was a brief pause. Then the voice of the human commander crackled through the comms. "Understood, Commander. Hold the line. Reinforcements are on the way, but you're on your own for now. Good luck, Maverick's Revenge. We're counting on you." Wilson glanced at his crew, their faces set in determination. "You heard the man. We hold this line." The Maverick's Revenge surged forward, its engine roaring as it moved to meet the oncoming wave of Kralian tanks. The battle for Tartarus 4 had begun, and the fate of the planet hung in the balance. The battlefield of Tartarus 4 was a chaotic symphony of destruction, with explosions tearing through the landscape as the two forces clashed. The Maverick's Revenge moved like a predator, cutting through the smoke and debris, its crew operating with the precision of a finely tuned machine. The Kralian devourers were bearing down on them, a wave of steel and death that seemed unstoppable. Commander Wilson, his eyes locked on the enemy, directed his crew with the calm authority of a man who had seen too many battles to be rattled by this one. Bradley, focus fire on their flanks. We need to create some breathing room. Patel, keep the rounds coming. Don't give them a chance to regroup. Lieutenant Bradley's hands moved with practiced ease, the tank's cannon swiveling to target the nearest devourer. The first shot rang out, a deafening roar as the high-velocity shell streaked across the battlefield and slammed into the side of a Kralian tank. The impact was devastating. The devourer's thick armor buckled, and the massive machine shuddered before grinding to a halt, smoke billowing from its ruptured hull. "Direct hit!" Bradley shouted, a grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Sergeant Patel was already loading the next round, her movements a blur of efficiency. "Round in, ready to fire." Corporal McCarthy gritted his teeth as he maneuvered the Maverick through the burning wreckage of other vehicles, the tank weaving through the carnage with an agility that belied its size. He could feel the rumble of the devourer's return fire, the ground shaking beneath them as plasma rounds and railgun slugs tore into the earth around them. Private Nguyen's voice cut through the noise, her calm demeanor a steadying presence. "Commander, I'm picking up chatter from the Kralian forces. They're regrouping. Looks like they're trying to encircle us." Wilson's mind raced as he processed the information. The Kralian were adapting quickly, and if they managed to surround the Maverick's Revenge, it would only be a matter of time before they were overwhelmed. But he wasn't about to let that happen. "Mac, we need to keep moving. Don't let them pin us down. Nguyen, keep coordinating with artillery. I want strikes on any cluster of devourers that tries to close in on us." The Maverick's engines roared as McCarthy pushed the tank forward, threading through the battlefield like a needle through cloth. The tank lurched as a near miss from a plasma cannon exploded nearby, but McCarthy held his course, his eyes locked on the terrain ahead. Bradley fired again, the cannon's recoil shaking the tank as another devourer exploded in a fiery blaze. But for every Kralian tank they destroyed, it seemed two more took its place. The enemy's numbers were overwhelming, and the Maverick's Revenge was at the center of the storm. The battle raged on, the crew of the Maverick's Revenge working in perfect sync as they fought to hold the line. But the Kralian were relentless, their tanks pressing in from all sides, their weapons tearing into the human defenses with merciless precision. Wilson could feel the strain on his crew. They were pushing their tank to its limits, and the constant barrage of enemy fire was taking its toll. The Maverick's armor, though formidable, was beginning to show signs of wear, scorch marks from plasma impacts, dents from near-miss railgun rounds. They were running out of time. As the Kralian horde continued its assault, the Maverick's Revenge found itself caught in a deadly gauntlet. Devourers closed in from both sides, their weapons firing in unison as they attempted to box the human tank in. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal and the deafening roar of explosions. "Nguyen, I need a status update," Wilson barked, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of battle. Nguyen's fingers flew over her console as she pulled up the latest intel. "Commander, we've got artillery strikes inbound, but they're not going to be enough to break the encirclement. We need to punch through their lines and regroup with the rest of our forces." Wilson nodded, his mind racing as he calculated their next move. They needed to break free of the Kralians' trap before it was too late. "Mac, we're going to punch through their left flank. Bradley, get ready to lay down covering fire. Patel, be ready with rapid reloads. We're going to need every shot." The Maverick's Revenge surged forward, its engines straining as McCarthy pushed it to maximum speed. Bradley's cannon roared, sending round after round into the Kralian tanks that dared to stand in their way. Devourers exploded in their path, but still more came, the Kralian showing no signs of letting up. As they neared the enemy's left flank, Wilson could see the gap they needed to exploit, a narrow corridor between two ridges where the Kralian line was weakest. It was a risky move, but it was their only chance. "Now, Mac, go," Wilson ordered. The Maverick's Revenge barreled forward, its cannon blazing as it tore through the Kralian lines. Bradley's shots were dead on, each one finding its mark and creating a path of destruction for them to follow. Patel worked furiously, loading round after round with machine-like precision, while Nguyen coordinated with artillery, calling in strikes that kept the Devourers at bay. They broke through the Kralians' left flank, the Maverick's Revenge charging out of the encirclement like a beast unleashed. The Kralian tanks were caught off guard, their formation breaking as the human tank carved a path through their ranks. But the battle was far from over. The Maverick's Revenge had escaped the trap, but the Kralian horde was still on their heels, and the crew knew they were only buying themselves time. As the Maverick roared across the battlefield, Wilson took a moment to glance back at the devastation they had left behind. The Kralian were regrouping, their tanks reforming to give chase. They had survived the gauntlet, but the real fight was still ahead. "Nguyen, get me an update on those reinforcements," Wilson said, his voice tight with the strain of battle. "Still en route, sir," Nguyen replied, "but they're not going to get here in time." Wilson set his jaw, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the horizon. "Then we'll just have to keep fighting." The crew of the Maverick's Revenge knew what was at stake. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running low on time, but they were not out of the fight. Not yet. The battlefield of Tartarus IV was a shattered landscape, a desolate expanse of craters, burning wreckage, and the twisted remains of fallen tanks. The Maverick's Revenge roared across this hellscape, its crew locked in a desperate struggle for survival. Despite their best efforts, the Kralian horde continued to press them from all sides, their numbers seemingly endless. Commander Wilson knew that they were running out of options. The Maverick's armor was scarred and battered, its systems pushed to the breaking point. The crew had fought valiantly, but the relentless tide of Kralian tanks was beginning to take its toll. They had to find a way to turn the tide, or they would be overrun. As they charged across the battlefield, Wilson's mind raced, searching for any advantage they could exploit. The Kralian tanks were formidable, but they were not invincible. The humans had scored a few lucky hits, taking out several of the massive Devourers, but they needed something more, a way to break the enemy's momentum and give their forces a chance to regroup. "Bradley, how's our ammo looking?" Wilson asked, his voice tense. "Running low, Commander," Lieutenant Bradley replied, his eyes still focused on the targeting scope. "We've got enough for a few more volleys, but after that, we're going to be down to small arms." Wilson grimaced. They had come too far to be taken out by a lack of ammunition. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. Private Nguyen's voice crackled through the comms, cutting through the tension. "Commander, I'm picking up something on the Kralian channels. There's a weak spot in their formation. It looks like one of their Devourers took a hit to its ammo rack, and it's about to blow. If we can trigger a chain reaction, we might be able to take out a good chunk of their force." Wilson's eyes widened as the possibilities clicked into place. A chain reaction among the Devourer's volatile ammunition could be the break they needed, but it would take a precise shot, a near impossible shot, given the chaos of the battlefield. "Bradley, did you hear that?" Wilson asked, his voice filled with urgency. "I heard it, sir," Bradley replied, a determined glint in his eyes. "I'll make the shot." Wilson nodded. He knew Bradley was the best gunner in the regiment, but even for him, this would be a challenge. The Devourers were heavily armored, and hitting an exact spot in the middle of a battle was like threading a needle during an earthquake. "Patel, keep those rounds coming. Mac, get us into position. Nguyen, stay on those comms. I want to know the moment that tank starts to cook off." The Maverick's Revenge maneuvered through the battlefield, dodging enemy fire as it closed in on the target. The Kralian tanks continued their relentless advance, their weapons spewing death and destruction in all directions. But the crew of the Maverick had their eyes on a singular goal, the Devourer that could change the course of the battle. "Got it in sight," Bradley muttered, adjusting his aim. His hands were steady, his breathing slow and measured. The targeting reticle locked onto the weak spot in the Kralian tank's armor, the spot where the volatile ammunition was stored. "Steady, steady," Wilson murmured, watching the target on his monitor. The seconds stretched out like hours, the tension in the tank so thick it was almost suffocating. Bradley's finger tightened on the trigger, and the tank's cannon roared as it fired. The shell streaked across the battlefield, a blur of steel and fire. For a moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance: the fate of the Maverick's revenge, the battle for Tartarus 4, the very survival of the human forces. The shell struck home, slamming into the side of the Devourer with a deafening explosion. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a thunderous roar, the Kralian tank erupted in a massive fireball, the explosion tearing through its armor and igniting the ammunition within. The chain reaction was instantaneous. The fireball spread from one tank to the next, each Devourer's volatile ammunition cooking off in a devastating cascade. The ground shook as a series of explosions ripped through the Kralian formation, sending shockwaves across the battlefield. The once impenetrable horde of Devourers was suddenly thrown into chaos, their ranks torn apart by the deadly chain reaction. "Direct hit!" Bradley shouted, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. The Maverick's revenge surged forward, taking advantage of the confusion. Commander Wilson didn't hesitate. He knew this was their moment. "Push through! Take out any stragglers!" Wilson ordered, his voice fierce with determination. The Maverick charged into the gap created by the explosions, its cannon blazing as it cut down the remaining Kralian tanks. Sergeant Patel worked like a machine, loading round after round with blinding speed, while Corporal McCarthy drove with the precision of a surgeon, weaving through the wreckage and debris. Private Nguyen kept the comms buzzing, coordinating with other human forces to exploit the breach. The Kralian, caught off guard by the sudden turn of events, faltered. Their once cohesive formation was now a disorganized mess, their tanks struggling to regroup in the face of the human counterattack. For the first time in the battle, the humans had the upper hand. As the last of the chain reaction subsided, the battlefield fell into a tense silence, broken only by the crackle of flames and the distant rumble of artillery. The Kralian horde had been dealt a crippling blow, and the Maverick's revenge stood tall, a lone survivor in a sea of destruction. Wilson took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. They had done it. They had turned the tide. But the battle was far from over. "Nguyen, get me a status report," Wilson ordered, his voice hoarse from the strain. Nguyen scanned the comms, her fingers flying over the console. "Kralian forces are in disarray, Commander. We've got a window, but it's closing fast. Reinforcements are still en route, but they're not here yet. We need to press the advantage while we can." Wilson nodded, his mind already racing ahead. They had bought themselves some time, but the Kralian would regroup quickly. They needed to press the attack, to keep the enemy off balance until reinforcements arrived. "All right, crew," Wilson said, his voice firm and resolute. "We're not out of this yet. We've got a chance to turn this whole battle around, and we're going to take it. Let's move out." The Maverick's revenge roared back into the fray, its crew ready to fight with renewed vigor. They had turned the tide, but the war for Tartarus 4 was far from won. The Kralian were regrouping, and the final showdown was just around the corner. The Maverick's revenge had broken through the Kralian lines, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. But even as the crew celebrated their small victory, the reality of their situation began to set in. The Kralian horde was still vast, and their numbers far exceeded those of the human forces. The chain reaction had given them a brief respite, but the enemy was far from defeated. Commander Zorvath, the Kralian commander, seethed with rage as he watched the aftermath of the explosion. The human tank, a single human tank, had managed to cripple a significant portion of his force. His warriors, once so confident in their superiority, were now struggling to regroup. But Zorvath was not one to be easily thwarted. He knew that a counterattack was essential to reclaiming control of the battlefield. "Regroup!" Zorvath bellowed through his command channel, his voice filled with anger and determination. "Form a new line and crush that human tank. No one survives." The surviving Kralian tanks began to reform, their massive forms moving with mechanical precision as they created a new battle line. The Devourers, though fewer in number, were still a formidable force, their weapons charged and ready to unleash devastation upon the Maverick's revenge. Meanwhile, inside the Maverick, the crew was preparing for the inevitable counterattack. The brief moment of relief after the chain reaction had quickly passed, replaced by the grim reality that they were still deep behind enemy lines, with no immediate backup in sight. "Nguyen, how close are those reinforcements?" Commander Wilson asked, his voice tense. "They're still about 15 minutes out, sir," Private Nguyen replied, her eyes scanning the comms readouts. "We're on our own until then." Wilson nodded, his expression hardening. "We've faced worse odds. We hold this position until they arrive. Bradley, conserve your ammo. Make every shot count. Patel, keep those rounds coming as fast as you can. Mac, I need you to be ready to maneuver at a moment's notice." The crew acknowledged their orders with a grim determination. They knew that this battle could be their last, but none of them were willing to back down. They had come too far, fought too hard, to give up now. The Kralian counterattack began with a thunderous roar, their Devourers charging forward with renewed ferocity. Plasma cannons and railguns fired in unison, creating a wall of destruction that seemed impossible to overcome. The ground shook as the Kralian unleashed their full might, determined to obliterate the Maverick's revenge and its crew. "Here they come!" Lieutenant Bradley shouted, his hands moving swiftly to target the incoming enemy tanks. The Maverick's cannon roared as Bradley fired, the shell streaking across the battlefield and slamming into the lead Devourer. The enemy tank exploded in a brilliant fireball, but the Kralian kept coming, their numbers overwhelming. Sergeant Patel worked furiously, loading round after round into the cannon, her hands a blur of motion. "Round in, ready to fire." Corporal McCarthy gripped the controls tightly, his eyes locked on the enemy as he maneuvered the tank to avoid incoming fire. The Maverick weaved through the battlefield, its armor absorbing hit after hit, but refusing to give in. McCarthy's driving was nothing short of masterful, each move calculated to keep them in the fight for as long as possible. Private Nguyen's voice cut through the chaos, her calm professionalism keeping the crew focused. "Commander, I'm picking up increased chatter on the Kralian channels. They're fully committed to this assault. No reserves." Wilson's mind raced as he processed the information. The Kralian were throwing everything they had at the Maverick's revenge, hoping to crush them before reinforcements could arrive. It was a gamble, but it meant that if they could hold out, the enemy would be vulnerable to a counterattack. "Bradley, focus on the lead tanks, break their momentum," Wilson ordered, his voice filled with urgency. The Maverick's cannon roared again, another Devourer exploding in a shower of sparks and debris. But for every tank they destroyed, more took its place. The Kralian horde was relentless, their firepower threatening to overwhelm the lone human tank. The ground around the Maverick was torn apart by plasma blasts and railgun impacts, the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning metal. The crew could feel the strain on their tank as it shuddered under the continuous barrage. The armor, though tough, was beginning to show the signs of wear, scorch marks, dents, and even a few breaches where the enemy fire had punched through. "Commander, we've got hull damage on the right side," Private Nguyen reported, her voice tinged with concern. Wilson gritted his teeth. They were running out of time. The Maverick was a tough tank, but it couldn't hold out forever. They needed to survive until reinforcements arrived, but the Kralian were determined to destroy them before that could happen. "Keep fighting," Wilson barked, refusing to let the crew's morale falter. "We're not done yet." The Maverick's revenge continued to fight with everything it had, but the odds were stacked against them. The Kralian tanks pressed in closer, their weapons tearing into the human defenses with relentless precision. It was a desperate all-or-nothing struggle, and the Maverick's crew knew that their survival depended on every shot, every maneuver. As the Kralian tanks closed in, Lieutenant Bradley took aim at one of the lead Devourers, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. The targeting reticle locked onto the enemy tank, and Bradley fired. The shell streaked across the battlefield, but before it could hit its mark, a plasma blast from another Devourer struck the Maverick, rocking the tank and throwing off Bradley's aim. The shell went wide, missing its target and detonating harmlessly in the distance. The Kralian tanks surged forward, their weapons ready to deliver the final blow. "Damn it!" Bradley cursed, his frustration palpable. Wilson's mind raced as he considered their options. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. But surrender was not an option. They had to keep fighting, no matter the odds. Just as the Kralian tanks prepared to unleash another volley, a thunderous roar filled the air. A sound that was not from the Maverick or the Kralian. It was the unmistakable sound of artillery shells, and they were incoming. "Nguyen, what's going on?" Wilson shouted, hope flickering in his chest. "Artillery strike, incoming," Nguyen replied, her voice tinged with relief. "It's ours." The ground shook as a massive barrage of artillery shells rained down on the Kralian tanks. The enemy formation was thrown into chaos as explosions tore through their ranks, the heavy shells obliterating tanks and sending debris flying in all directions. The Kralian tanks that had been poised to deliver the final blow were suddenly consumed by fire and smoke. The Maverick's crew watched in awe as the enemy tanks were torn apart by the artillery barrage, their once formidable formation shattered in an instant. "Reinforcements are arriving," Nguyen called out, her voice filled with renewed energy. The Kralian counterattack had been broken. The Maverick's revenge had held the line long enough for the human artillery to arrive, and now the tide of battle was turning once again. Commander Wilson allowed himself a brief smile. They had survived the counterattack, but the fight was not over yet. The Kralian forces were in disarray, and now was the time to strike back. "Bradley, Patel, prepare for a full assault. Mac, get us moving. Nguyen, keep coordinating with the incoming forces. We're not out of this yet." The Maverick's engines roared to life as the tanks surged forward, leading the charge against the shattered Kralian forces. The battlefield was still a war zone, but the balance of power had shifted. The humans had survived the counterattack, and now they were on the offensive. The arrival of reinforcements brought a surge of hope to the beleaguered crew of the Maverick's Revenge. The distant thundering of artillery echoed across the battlefield, a sound that signified not just support, but a turning tide in the desperate fight against the Kralian horde. Commander Wilson glanced at his crew, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and renewed determination. The brief respite from the chaos had allowed them to catch their breath, but they knew the battle was far from over. "Nguyen, confirm the positions of the incoming units," Wilson ordered, his voice steady despite the exhaustion etched into his features. Private First Class Lisa Nguyen tapped rapidly on her console, her eyes scanning the incoming data streams. "Commander, we've got 3 additional tanks approaching from the north and east. They're part of the main reinforcement fleet, equipped with heavy artillery and anti-aircraft systems." Wilson nodded. "Excellent. We need to coordinate our efforts. Once they're in position, we can launch a coordinated assault to push the Kralian back." Lieutenant Bradley glanced over at Sergeant Patel, who was already checking their ammunition reserves. "Patel, how's our ammo holding up after that counterattack?" Patel gave a brief nod. "We're down about 30%, but we can manage until the reinforcements arrive. I recommend we conserve where possible and focus on high-priority targets." "Understood," Wilson replied. "Mac, keep the Maverick moving strategically. We need to maintain a position that allows us to support both the incoming reinforcements and our existing fire lines." Corporal McCarthy nodded, his hands deftly maneuvering the tank through the treacherous terrain. The ground around them was a testament to the ferocity of the ongoing battle. Smoldering craters, twisted metal, and the remnants of both human and Kralian machinery littered the landscape. As the hours passed, the crew worked tirelessly, their movements synchronized through countless drills and the unspoken bond forged in the heat of combat. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the battlefield and adding an eerie glow to the scene of destruction. Suddenly, Nguyen's voice broke through the tension. "Commander, incoming artillery units are on the move. They're deploying heavy shellers and support drones." Wilson's eyes narrowed as he assessed the new threat. "All right, everyone, listen up. These artillery units can turn the tide even further in our favor if we use them correctly. Nguyen, prioritize drone support. Let's keep our skies clear. Bradley, coordinate with the new tanks to focus fire on the Kralian's remaining devourers. The Maverick's engines hummed with renewed energy, as Corporal McCarthy adjusted their position to provide optimal coverage for both the incoming reinforcements and the existing human forces. The coordination between the Maverick and the reinforcements was seamless, a testament to the rigorous training and unyielding spirit of the human military. Minutes later, the reinforcements arrived with a display of overwhelming firepower. The heavy artillery units unleashed a barrage of high-explosive shells, tearing through the Kralian ranks with surgical precision. The anti-aircraft systems sweared overhead, ensuring that no aerial threats could complicate their assault. "Now's our chance," Wilson shouted, feeling the adrenaline surge through him. "All units, focus on the remaining devourers. Let's finish this." The combined might of the Maverick's revenge and the reinforcements created a formidable front. The Kralian, already reeling from the earlier chain reactions, and the human counterattack, struggled to maintain their cohesion. Their tanks, though still numerous, began to falter under the relentless human onslaught. Lieutenant Bradley fired another round, his cannon roaring as it struck another devourer, sending it spiraling into flames. Sergeant Patel kept the rounds flowing, her hands moving with mechanical precision to ensure no opportunity was wasted. Meanwhile, Nguyen coordinated with the incoming artillery, calling in precise strikes that dismantled Kralian formations before they could mount a meaningful resistance. Her calm and methodical approach provided a crucial anchor for the crew amidst the chaos. As the battle intensified, Commander Wilson could feel the scales tipping in their favor. The Kralian forces, once confident in their overwhelming numbers and advanced technology, were now visibly struggling to keep up. Their tanks began to overheat from the continuous bombardment, and their formation started to crumble. But the Kralian were not ready to surrender. Zorvath, watching from his command devourer, recognized the shift in momentum. His once unwavering confidence was now tinged with desperation. "Reinforce the flanks. We cannot afford to lose this battle," he commanded, his voice echoing through the comms. However, the human forces were relentless. The combined firepower of the Maverick's revenge and the reinforcements proved too much for the Kralian to withstand. One by one, the devourers began to falter, their systems failing under the onslaught. In a final, desperate attempt, Zorvath ordered a full-scale assault, rallying the remaining Kralian tanks for one last push. But it was too late. The human forces had already broken through their lines, and the Maverick's revenge led the charge, plowing through the disorganized Kralian ranks with unyielding force. The battle reached its crescendo as the last of the Kralian tanks were neutralized, their hulking forms reduced to smoldering wrecks. The once impenetrable horde had been defeated, their invasion halted by the indomitable spirit and tactical prowess of the human defenders. As the dust settled, Commander Wilson surveyed the battlefield, the cost of victory evident in the scars left upon Tartarus IV. The Maverick's revenge stood as a beacon of human resilience, its crew battered but unbroken. "We did it," Wilson said, his voice tinged with both relief and sorrow. "We held the line." Lieutenant Bradley offered a tired smile. "Just another day in paradise, sir." Sergeant Patel gave a weary nod. "We held our ground and pushed them back. Reinforcements should be here any moment." Corporal McCarthy eased the tank into a secure position, the vibrations from the recent bombardment slowly fading. "Let's hope this is the last we see of them." Private Nguyen took a moment to debrief, her fingers still flying over the console to finalize communications with the reinforcements. "Commander, the artillery units are securing the perimeter, and additional support teams are en route to assist with the cleanup and medical operations." Wilson allowed himself a moment of respite, the enormity of their achievement settling in. "Good work, everyone. Let's make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." As night fell over Tartarus IV, the battlefield began to quiet, the echoes of war giving way to the somber reality of the aftermath. The Maverick's revenge, though scarred, remained a symbol of hope and determination, a testament to what humanity could achieve even in the darkest of times. But amidst the victory, Commander Wilson couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Kralian might have been repelled for now, but the war was far from over. The true challenge lay ahead, ensuring that humanity could withstand whatever the Kralian would throw their way next. For now, though, they had won, and that was a victory worth savoring.